thank you all for coming. I hope you've had a chance to do the reading. We're going to try something new, and that is that Hope has discovered that those lights light up. So if we could have the lights turned off as an experiment first. No. You can see the screen better, right? Can you write in the dark? Off or on? Off. You just don't want to look at me. We get the high tech down at the end of the semester. Okay. I think that this is an appropriate and yet an inappropriate time to talk about the subject matter. And that is, first of all, about resistance, and second of all, about rescue. Nowhere was resistance or rescue more prominent than in occupied Denmark during the war. So, the goal for today is to understand the nature of collective resistance, and by that I mean resistance in a group, and how individual action can transform into organized resistance, a social activity. To get some idea about how that evolves, it doesn't just happen, it's a process. And to understand the Danish experience in the context of the Holocaust. I think at some point it's really interesting for us to disclose how we become interested in certain topics. And for me, my interest in the Holocaust began very much perhaps like some of you when I was a young girl. And I read The Diary of Anne Frank. And it was at that point that I wondered, being Jewish, whether if I read enough about the Holocaust that perhaps I could be ready and prepared should somebody ever come for me. And it touched me very, very deeply and started a lifelong exploration into the Holocaust. But at some point, I became so depressed reading about all of the perpetrators and why they did things. And as I grew older, I was looking to just stop studying about the Holocaust. It was too much for me. And then I read a book by a German Jewish emigre, whose name you already know, because she's mentioned in your texts, Hannah Arendt. And she went to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who you also know about, and reported on the trial in the New Yorker magazine. And that began what I consider to be my adult exploration into the Holocaust. But among other things, she commented on Eichmann, but I came across a paragraph in her book that stunned me. And she said, one is tempted to recommend the story, The Danish Rescue, as required reading in political science for all students who wish to learn something about the enormous power potential inherent in nonviolent action and in resistance to an opponent possessing vastly superior means of violence. That sent me looking in other places. was also very lucky around that time to have decided to come back to Sonoma State as a student and to have found that the sociology department was offering a course on the sociology of the Holocaust. And it was very strange to see that because I had come back as a marketing major. And I was a marketing major for one semester and then changed my major to sociology. He's been here the past couple of weeks, but he's here again. I'd like to point out the person who sent me on this journey that has me ending here. John Steiner, Professor Steiner. I'm glad you could come. I'm sure I'll get a good critique after I finish. Okay, before we can understand, perhaps, the situation in Denmark, we need to know about the principal forms of German domination in Europe. These are not all inclusive, but they're the most important ones. And the first one is annexation. And the Germans annexed or brought into the German Reich Czechoslovakia and Austria. They directly administered through military and civilian administration France, Holland, and the government general of Poland. And then they had what they called guardianships, or as I point them out to be, fictitious autonomy that was giving the country supposed independence. And that was what happened in Denmark. There were also independent allies of the Germans who were fascist governments, such as Italy, Hungary, and Romania. For those of you who are still recovering from the map quiz, you'll recognize this map of Europe, so you can kind of put yourself back into geography and see that at the tip of Germany is Denmark. Germany and Denmark share a land bridge, as it were, with each other. This is not an old map, it's kind of current map. Yes, there's the Czech Republic. So, but you can see how close Germany and Denmark to each other. The invasion of Denmark was rather swift. But let's talk about what the immediate goals of the Germans were. The first thing they wanted to do was to strip the country of its raw materials and foodstuffs. And you saw a bit of that in the newsreel that you saw last week. They just looted Denmark, taking cattle and pigs. You know, the Danes are known for their ham, grain, and it was very convenient for them because they gave the Danes IOUs. They did not give them any money for anything that they took. The second purpose was to make the citizens work for the German war effort, both in the country that they were in, but also as forced laborers in Germany. They were forced laborers in other places, but they were taken and forced to work in factories in Germany. Of course, concentration camp. People who were in concentration camps also worked in factories. And then one more goal, carry out the final solution by segregating and deporting the Jews in the countries that they occupied. So, what were the responses to these Nazi occupiers? Well, many people collaborated with the Germans. When the Germans came, they immediately joined in with what they were doing. The most common thing that the countries that had some control over their fate, the most common thing was accommodation. To kind of go along to get along. Get along to go along. The next thing that occurred in almost every country was passive resistance. And we'll talk about that later. It took on several different qualities. And the last thing was collective or social resistance, where people banded together to resist the Germans. This was less possible in places where the Germans ruled with a heavy hand. As you know from your reading, this was not a very solution in Poland, but it was more possible in places like Denmark, where the Germans were less interested in ruling with a heavy hand. So let's talk about collaboration first. What you see there is a poster from Norway, and it says, with Quisling, who was the Norwegian Prime Minister, who was a collaborator, and translated, there's a lot in Scandinavian languages that is very much like English, with Quisling for the new Norway. So there are two kinds of collaboration. Ideological. In many countries that the Germans occupied, there were Nazi parties, native Nazi parties. Even the Danes had a Danish Nazi party. There were fascist parties in Hungary and Romania. So collaboration took on the perspective of ideological collaboration. And then there was economic collaboration. If you think about it, people saw great opportunities when the Germans came to make some money. Just having the German army in the country raised all kinds of opportunities. Feeding the troops, giving them haircuts, selling them underwear to send home to their wives and girlfriends. At some level, this kind of collaboration I sometimes call opportunistic collaboration. The next category is accommodation. What you see there is a picture of the Danish ruling, well, the parliament. It's not the parliament, but it's the Danish government officials. It'd be like a cabinet, I guess. And accommodation is more difficult to categorize. Accommodators were generally government officials. And most governments, especially the Danish government, engaged in compromise politics. They sought to delay or to thwart the application of certain German policies, and government workers attempted to obstruct or delay German orders. And I'm talking about that in the context of Denmark. And we know from the reading that things were very different in Denmark than they might have been in Holland. Although the Dutch government in residence was collaborationist. I'll give you an example from Denmark. During the first year of the occupation of Denmark by the Germans, the Germans requested the loan of 8 small Danish naval ships, ships that would traverse the harbor. The Danish government expressed its regret. It said, "We regret," and said it could not transfer the boats because it would violate the agreement of neutrality that the Danes signed with the Germans when they occupied them. The Germans kept pushing. but Denmark did not position. Eventually they were forced to accede to the German demands, but rather than comply, the Danes disarmed the boats by removing their guns and navigation equipment, and the ships were delivered to the Germans completely unusable. And so we might call accommodation a form of conditional accommodation, and certainly the Danes were very pragmatic, stalling at every bend in the road to avoid doing the Germans' bidding. So let's move on to talk about resistance. The categories that I've created in this typology or scheme about resistance is to talk about passive resistance, active resistance, and then what I call armed resistance. So passive resistance I define as an internal state. It's internal to a person. It originates with individuals. And it precedes active resistance. And you can also think of it as dissidence, being a feeling of dissonance with what is going on and identifying what is going on as wrong. That's thinking. It's not much more than that.
Dr. Goodman, could you return to the previous slide?
I will.
Thank you.
Oh, did it jump?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thanks for pointing that out. But passive resistance can also be publicly manifested. And it's my contention that the exhibition of a kind of passive resistance immediately transfers it into a social act. I'll give you an example. The Danes are fond, even now, but especially then, wearing enameled pins, you know, the kind like you get at Disneyland with Mickey Mouse's face on them. And they sell them at the Olympics with all of the different sports on them. They're small enameled pins. When the Germans invaded, there was a very hot market in several different kinds of pins. The first one was a pin with the Danish flag on it. Another was one that had letters on it that stood for phrases like, throw them out. Others were in the colors of the British Air Force, because the Danes had very close relationships with England. So if you wore one of those pins and you saw someone else with one of those pins, it really began to be oh, they feel the same way that I do. As resistance evolves, it eventually becomes social, or an activity that one does with others. So social resistance is the process of by the members of a society using unarmed means and mobilizing either the society's public institutions or its people, or both at the same time. And I'm going to repeat that for you. Social resistance is the process of resisting by the members of a society using unarmed means and mobilizing either the society's public institutions or its people, or it's both, at the same time. It is usually enacted when you have a mindset to resist any kind of what I call political submission. And it should be noted here that when people feel less submissive, they become more and more uncontrollable. Right around exam time, they're very, very submissive. You can control them. But when the semester's over. Okay, so there are many forms of collective social resistance. When the Danish government arrested members of the Communist Party in 1941, there were large, widespread student demonstrations. Following through on several lecturers' point that much of this resistance begins with youth. It begins with students and young people. At various times, Danes also engaged in work stoppages and strikes. All these actions were done in groups and represented well-organized public acts of resistance. So we've gone from thinking about, I don't think those people should do that, to wearing pins to let people know that you're on the same page, as it were, to actually doing some kind of public act. Okay, now we come to what we know more familiarly, what we have more familiarity with, and that is armed resistance. Now, sabotage can be termed acts against property, but it also includes physical attacks on persons. Armed resistance does. I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine you're a university student in occupied Denmark, and that as the weeks and the months of the German occupation have continued, you observe that many people haven't really made much of an effort to resist. Your uncle owns a small metal fabricating business, and he is making parts for the Germans to put in their airplanes. Business has never been better for him. A friend whose father works in the shipyards says the workers are working day and night building and repairing German ships. It is clear to you that some people have chosen the route of economic collaboration. But there are other people who join the Danish Nazi Party, and they work closely with German authorities, preparing anti-Semitic demonstrations and publications that repeat German racial hatred with a Danish national twist. There are some, but not very many, who engage in this ideological collaboration. You also look around you, and it appears that members of the service and the government also appear to be cooperating with the Germans, but it's clear many of them do this because it's part of their job, and also because of their loyalty to the country and to the king, who has asked that there be no turmoil, and that you obey and act properly. You should know later, when the Germans decide to deport the Jews, you realize that members of the government and some of the police, including New Divey, who we talked about and seen, take very active roles in the rescue operation. Their actions involve considerable risk, and while some of them take part in operations that serve the Germans' interests, they do this to escape detection, to be the good people, and to keep their jobs. That's kind of a reflection of the policy of accommodation. Now, this is not new because it's about a month ago now, we had a lecture on armed Jewish resistance. And I'm not going to be talking about that today, but I did want to remind you that what was at stake for Jews and for the Polish resistance was very often very different from what was at stake for people in the Western European countries. Just another picture to break up the text for you. The other thing, too, that I'd like you to think about is that the people who lived in relative ease, compared, of course, to the Jews and the other victims of the Nazis, were making choices. Very often the Jews who chose to join resistance movements, or who had the opportunity, could do that, were making what might be choiceless choices. Now we talk about collective social resistance. It takes reform, economic, political, and moral. That is a picture of young Knut Dybye, who was a Danish policeman. He has been honored twice as a righteous person and is responsible for saving hundreds of Danish Jews, and he proudly points out members of the United States Air Force who were shot down and eventually made their way to Copenhagen, and he was able to get them on boats to Sweden, as well as the people they called the resistance men in Denmark, who were members of the resistance movement. Now you imagined somehow you were living in Denmark during the occupation. I would ask you to imagine again that you're awakened one morning to the sound of airplanes flying overhead. You go outside and you see the sky filled with fighter aircraft and bombers. And I know that I wrote this putting together the words of someone who was a young Dane who I interviewed about what it was like to be a young person in Denmark during the occupation. You realize after seeing swastikas on the tail sections of the planes and hearing explosions in the distance that war has come to your country. You're a student, and you are deathly afraid of what lies ahead. Later that day, you turn on your radio, and the king is asking the nation to remain calm. The government has surrendered and reached an agreement with the Germans. The king, who you respect and admire, he's a greatly beloved figure in Denmark, asks you to go about your everyday business and your everyday life, and to refrain from taking action against the Germans. So even though you're angry and resentful, you do what you have been brought up to do and what you've always done. You obey the king and you follow the law. I can't impress upon you more how important those ideas were in Denmark. Obey the king, follow the law. To a point. In your heart, you hate what the Nazis stand for. You have read they are responsible for terrible atrocities against German Jews, and there are rumors that they are systematically persecuting Jews in Eastern Europe. You are ashamed that some of your fellow Danes have joined the Danish party, and in the days following the Nazi occupation, when you go to school or to work, you wear red and white, national colors as a sign of your patriotism and as a sign of your defiance of the Germans. You have become a passive resistor, as I mentioned before. So, who were the resistors? Well, they were political activists. In Denmark, members of the Communist Party, Social Democrats, patriots, members of the Social Democratic Party, just about anybody who was involved in politics. Average citizens resisted. Business leaders resisted, even though many of them were doing very, very well, feeding at the Nazi trough, as it were. We all saw the resistance going into the factory and blowing it up. Very often they had information from the businessmen who owned those factories when would be the best time to go in. Religious leaders. You'll see a little, or you may have read, I forget whatever, the statement that was made in the pulpits in Denmark on the eve of the threatened deportation of the Jews, where the Danish clergy declared that Jews and Christian Danes were a people joined by religion and were to be supported in every way, and that Danes were not to get involved with persecuting them. And perhaps the most interesting thing that I found that is not very original, but it was students. I had one fellow tell me that his teacher had him riding his bike with its basket, and inside the basket, the teacher, who was a chemistry teacher, had put several explosive devices, and he told him, whatever you do, don't fall. And he was extremely proud that he was able to do something. We'll see a little later on about underground newspapers. Students distributed underground newspapers. They were very, very active resistors. But the leaders in the resistance are what I call early risers. They were people who, from the very beginning, decided that they would obey the law, but they would try and figure out ways to get around it. And so, I want to remind you also that in Denmark, the formative situation around which the Danish resistance movement became a movement, where the separate parts began and did join together, was the issue of the safety of the Jews in Denmark. I briefly want to tell you that in the piece that I wrote, I referred to not the Danish Jews, but the Jews in Denmark. And the reason that I do that is because the Danes never separated out and said, we'll save everybody who can prove they're a Danish citizen. They felt very strongly that if you were Jewish, you were in trouble, and that you did not need to be a citizen of Denmark to have a chance at getting to safety. And so that semantic difference of not Danish Jews, but Jews in Denmark. And the reason for that was there were at least 600 or 700 Jews who had come to Denmark when they left the Russia during the pogroms, when many Jews came to the United States. And also there were young people who were training on Danish farms in the hope of migrating to Palestine to become farmers. There was a whole group of children who were at Danish summer camp, who had come to Denmark to summer camp, who were unable to get back home after the war, who were also being protected by the Danes. So it was never Danish Jews, and it was always the Jews in Denmark. So what did some of these people do to get around active confrontation with the Danes, with the Germans? Well, they did what young people did in many places, in Holland as well, and also in France, but in no place did underground newspapers flourish like they did in Denmark. And many people found out about how to get more involved in the resistance movements by reading these newspapers. When I was at the Danish Royal Library going through these, they would bring me box after box after box and saying, well, I hope this was the last one. But they ranged, there were some in Braille. The communists had their underground paper. The religious groups had their underground newspapers. The students had at least 30 or 35. No matter what your political persuasion, you could find an underground newspaper that told you what was really happening and was calling you to arms, or at least to action, based on what you knew to be your truth. Now, this is a translation of a poster that started going up all over Copenhagen the day after the Germans invaded. It is, the origin of it is unclear. I've read lots of different things, that it was student-oriented and other people said it wasn't, and maybe it didn't come the first day, but maybe it was in the first year. But what's important in here is the Danes expressing exactly how they thought a good Dane would act. You must not go to work in Germany. The Germans were recruiting people to go and work in their armaments industry, to work on the farms. You must do bad work for the Germans. So if you were working for them, you needed to work slowly and act rather stupid, which they're not. You must work in slow motion for the Germans. Now this is a translation of the Danish. You must destroy all the tools and machines that could be useful to the Germans. So if you were working at a ball bearing machine and you could figure out a way to throw a wrench in it to ruin it, you should do that. You must destroy anything that can be profitable to the Germans. You must delay transports to Germany, boycott German newspapers and films, buy nothing from German stores. You must give traders what they deserve. Notice that's unqualified. And you must protect those that the Germans pursue. 10 Commandments from the Dane. There's one of them. If you can see it, it's kind of hard. They're mimeographed, they're not printed. And even close up, they're hard to read, but you can see those two Germans and what are they doing? They're looking at some Danish pastry and they are salivating. Can't see it. Okay, so now we come to slowly thinking about resistance. You're resisting in rather acceptable ways according to what the king has told you about how to behave. You're just kind of spreading word about the Nazis, but things are getting kind of they're getting more difficult. So we talk about forms of rescue during the Holocaust. And the forms of rescue during the Holocaust, and I'm talking about this generally, the most common form of rescue was by individuals, working alone. Not the only kind, but the most common kind, because of the danger involved with letting other people know what you were doing. And then there were instances of collective action. There were groups of resistance groups in every country. In France, there were several groups in Holland. There was even a group in Poland. The name of that group was Goodman. And they are responsible for saving hundreds of Jews. You can imagine, I hope, how treacherous that must have been. Well, as it is, the Danes were rescued by ferried across the sea. And that's a picture of a Danish fisherman. It's kind of fuzzy because it's real small. I tried to make it bigger for the PowerPoint. Almost 8,000 people taken across the Sound. The people who did it were the fishermen, in collaboration with people like New Diving and several resistance groups. But there are some that I think some of you know about, who we can put a face on, and that is, how many of you have read about Corrie ten Boom? Dutch. She's a Dutch, I forget what her religion was, very religious woman. She and her sister hid Jews in their home and eventually were deported to a concentration camp themselves. A very brave woman. This is by no means indicative, but I did want to let you see that there were some people with real faces. Irene Good-Opdyke, she was born in Poland. She was a nurse who, after being released from a concentration camp herself, rescued 12 Jews. She had hid half of them in the forests, brought them food and supplies. The other 6 she hid in the villa of a Nazi officer who had requisitioned her as his servant, right under his nose. There are 2 people that are very close to Sonoma State's heart. In this photo by Ilka Hartman, 2 righteous Gentiles. That means that they have been recognized by Yad Vashem as rescuers. New Divey on the left, Otto Springer, who Dr. Steiner knew quite well before he passed on the right. So what in the world would lead to this rescue of the Jews? There was increasing unrest in Denmark. People were going on strike. There were slowdowns in the factories, etc. And there was, if you remember the newsreel you saw, finally it was coming to a breaking point in August of 1943. And on the 29th, the Germans declared martial law. There had been growing food shortages, and more of the necessities of life were harder and harder to get. Now, you're that same person and you read that the rail lines are being sabotaged all over the country. And the Germans have arrested many young people. In an effort to stop these attacks, they institute the death penalty, which doesn't exist in Denmark. There is incredible rage over this. And because of the institution of the death penalty, the government of Denmark resigns. They are no longer reach their limit with what they will do in terms of accommodating the Germans. And then one day, and this is really how it happened, generally. One day in September 43, you learn through the grapevine, through rumors, through underground newspapers, that the Germans intend to deport the Jews in Denmark, and that the Jews have gone into hiding. This happened in a very, this happened in the country that brought us Hans Christian Andersen. And it is, on some level, a fairy tale, because it in no way represents what happened to most people during the Holocaust. But it is a good way of understanding what could have happened, perhaps, if things had been different. I have read about cab drivers who heard that the Jews needed to go into hiding because the Germans were coming after them. And one cab driver who didn't think he knew anybody who was Jewish, who went to a telephone booth, picked up a phone book, and started going through it looking for names that seemed Jewish. And he called people and he said to them, listen, you shouldn't be home now. I'm going to come over there and take you someplace safe. Someone who I interviewed said that he was at his home. I would call upper middle class family. The phone rang, and he answered the phone, and the person on the other end of the line said, may I speak with Mr. Grun, please? And he said, may I tell him who's calling? And he said, no, you may not. He gave the phone to his father. His father had a conversation. His father said, do you have a close Gentile friend who will let you stay with them for the night? And he said, well, yeah, my tennis buddy, Jorgen. And he said, well, okay, go there right now. Don't call. Go. And tomorrow we will figure out, and tomorrow meet us at a certain place. And it was done like that, anonymous phone calls. One of the things that did happen to some people was, right next to the main synagogue in the city of Copenhagen, there was an old people's home, and they forgot to get the old people. So they were eventually deported to Dresden. So you don't know anybody who's Jewish, but you heard that people are collecting money. This also happened. So you go to your wealthy uncle and tell him that you need $4,000 for charity. Without asking a question, he gives you the money. You suspect that, like most people, he knows exactly where the money is going. In a short time, you collect a sizable amount of money. I heard that people who needed money, and the reason they needed money was to pay the fishermen, who went to banks and said things along the line like, I need $4,000 to send 2 packages to Sweden. Could I have the money? And all they had to do was sign an IOU, and they were given the equivalent of $4,000. That could only happen in the same country that brought us Hans Christian Andersen. That someone in a bank, try it. Try it. Go to the bank and write out a note. I need some money to feed some children in Darfur. Could you give me $500? I'll sign an IOU. What do you think might happen? Nothing. A friend tells you, however, with this $4,000, where to deliver the money. Now remember, you are gradually getting involved When you get there, there are lots of people there, and one of the people is in charge asks you to take 3 people in a taxi to the harbor. You are given instructions about who to deliver the people to. And you eventually do this several times. You have become a rescuer. Now remember I told you that there were ambulance drivers also involved. And this is the largest hospital in Copenhagen. It's still there. You can see it's pretty big. The staff at this hospital turned the hospital into an assembly center, and it's estimated that over 2,000 Jews were assisted here. That's about a fourth of the people who were able to get to Sweden. When asked what diagnosis should be written on the patient's chart, one nurse replied in characteristic Danish humor, "Why, German measles, of course." True, and nothing I'm telling you. In addition, the doctors' organizations in Copenhagen reached out to doctors in the countryside and alerted them to people who might have to get on fishing boats and advised them of different ways that they might put them down to the city. So that's a Danish fishing boat. It sits in the Holocaust Museum in Washington. It's not very big. And sometimes 10 people would be crammed in there. Someone who I interviewed told me about someone who was just known, eventually they knew her name, the girl in the red hat. And she was a pediatrician, and she regularly gave the children smelling salts or some kind of ether or something when they were getting in the boats to put them to sleep so they wouldn't cry or make noise. So 8,000 people were taken across the Sound to Sweden. If you look at the yellow arrows, if they're real big, that's where most of the rescue went on. You can see all the way up at the top. There's a town, it's spelled funny and it's pronounced even funny. It's Gilleleje. There's a church up there, and there were 30 or 40 people who were hiding in the top of the church, the attic, waiting for a boat to take them that short distance across to Sweden, and they were turned in. Someone betrayed them. And this is an interesting thing, because what happened at Gilleleje has become almost like what children do in our schools at Thanksgiving. You know, they tell the whole story of how the Pilgrims came to the United States. the future. And that is people who betray, people who are at risk. So the Danish case is the most dramatic example of collective or social defense of the Jews during the war, following an attempt by the German occupiers to deport the approximately 8,000 Jews in Denmark. Danes from all levels of Danish society facilitated their escape to Sweden. The logistics involved with hiding and transporting several thousand men, women, and children to Sweden were complex. The Danes needed boats and fishermen willing to make the journey, as well as the money to pay them. Danish Jews who had the resources paid for their own passage, but there were some who did not have enough money. Jewish community funds could not be used because this is all done in secret, and they couldn't exhibit that they were taking money out of their community funds. An author quotes a pastor and a rescuer of the Jews. When you needed money, you simply went to the bank and asked the teller for 5,000 or 10,000 kroner, stating your purpose, and the money was promptly handed to you. Very few records were kept during the rescue operation, so it's difficult to reconstruct specific organizational contributions. It was very frustrating for me when I did my research. Or to add up the countless number of people who participated in the rescue, many of whom never publicly acknowledged their participation. In general, it was accomplished by small groups of rescuers working with individuals and other small groups. A foremost Danish historian told me that according to interviews he conducted, he estimates that thousands of Danes participated in the rescue. Wealthy businessmen contributed money to pay for the costs incurred during the rescue and to support the Jewish Danes in Sweden until the end of the war. Funds were also collected from school children, kind of like we passed the can around today. That's another way to raise money. Unlike the experience of the vast majority of European Jews, after the war, Jewish Danes returned to Denmark and found their homes and belongings intact. I interviewed someone who was a very young child who was taken to Sweden, and she told me that when they came back to the house, their neighbor had taken care of their plants. The plants were all taken care of. And that she was very, very embarrassed. And when asked, she said, I'm sorry, I'm just sorry. I just couldn't help it. And when asked what she had done, she said that she had been conscripted to do forced labor in Germany. And that in order to send him on his way and to comfort him with something from Denmark, she took one of the jars of preserved strawberries and gave it to him for the trip. But she said, that's the only thing I took, was one jar of strawberries. I think that's pretty incredible. There were no instances of looting of Jews' homes. And in fact, the fellow that I told you about who went to Sweden said that his family were jewelers, and they had a factory in Copenhagen and a factory in Malmö, Sweden, and that when they came back, the business had been looked over by one of their employees, and that every single stone, every ounce of gold, every dollar was accounted for. It's probably hard for us as Americans I just think of Hans Christian Andersen. It's just one of his fairy tales, right? So, what are the conventional explanations for the successful rescue of the Jews? Well, people's... Oh, those are... I'm sorry, I skipped something. When the Jews went to Sweden, they started businesses up. They weren't there that long because the war was over in May of 1945. But the Swedes helped. The Danish government sent support. And the person that I talked to was one of those children, although I think she was a lot younger. In any case, so what are the conventional explanations for the successful rescue of the Jews in Denmark? Well, the first one is that there were only a small number of Danish Jews. There were only 8,000 of them. But my response to that is, although Jews only represented 0.3% of the total Danish population, this proportion is just about the same as the proportion of German Jews. 0.3%. Yet only 5% of the German Jews survived the war. Neutral Sweden was just right across the way. Yes, couldn't have been done without Swedish help. But I only need to point to neutral Sweden, which consistently turned Jews away from its doors, to recognize that geographic proximity really had nothing to do with this. And it never guaranteed safe refuge for the Jews. The date of the planned deportation was late in the war. I don't know how. I guess there were a lot of people in Sweden who understood that the Germans were going to lose and that maybe they needed to cover their butts. That's not sufficient. It might have been necessary, but it wasn't a sufficient explanation. And the Germans were only half-hearted in their desire for the Jews in Denmark. There's a historian who says, well, the Germans kind of let them go. It's less the Danes saved them, but the Germans let them go. And in talking to almost 100 people, I would suggest that nobody who was involved thought the Germans were an easy mark in all of this, and that they were terrified for their lives, and that many people did die. So, I'd like to end to talk about how this might make any sense to us. And to ask the question whether the rescue of the Danish Jews was that easy. Of course it wasn't. We can only imagine the fear and uncertainty the Jews in Denmark and their rescuers experienced. So I'd like to close with some ideas about how resistance and rescue in Denmark were related. We know that fueling the resistors and the rescuers' activity was an ideological goal of the collective identity of their society. That is their fundamental collective values. What the Danes did was to reaffirm who they believed they were as a people and as a nation. So I ask you to consider the following. To confront the situation and stand up to the occupier, it was necessary to create new rules. They had to learn how to break the law because they were good law-abiding people. To adopt new behaviors. To work out new social practices. And to establish new institutions that could be adapted to the situation. Resistors and rescuers were new social innovators, but they were fashioned from strongly held beliefs and the solid collective values inherent in Danish society. Our lesson from their action over 60 years ago should be to ask questions of ourselves. What do we have to defend today? Collective values. On what are those values based? And what values deserve to be defended if the integrity of our society is threatened? I'm sure you will agree with me that asking and answering those questions has never been more important than it is. And I'd like to close with a little bit of sociology, and that is a very well-known Holocaust scholar by the name of Helen Fine has said that the Holocaust happened because there was a breakdown in the notion that we are all obligated to each other, and that we are all should question what is included in our own universe of obligation. What constitutes the circle of persons toward whom obligations are owed, to whom the rules apply, whose injuries call for compensation by the community at large. The Danish rescue draws us back to ponder the necessity of expanding our notion of who might be included in our circle of obligation. Who are we responsible for? As our increasingly globalized world brings us closer together, we should think about who we would like to include in our universe of obligation. I thank you for your attention. And I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have. If you go to Denmark, you have to send me a postcard. Yes. You said I was.
There are some interesting things which need to be mentioned. That after the war, in my interviews with former members of the SS,
Can you hear?
I've met some Danes and interviewed them as to why they fought with the Nazis.
You interviewed some Danes and asked them why they fought with the Nazis.
And the interesting response was not that because they were very sympathetic towards the National Socialists, but because they were afraid of the Soviets, the communists. And that's why they joined the SS. And that, I think, is a very important detail, because they themselves were not at all dreadfully impressed by the racist type of ideology, but they're more afraid of what would happen if the Soviets would win. And I think that's was a very interesting sort of commentary by these people who had joined the SS.
There was a group of Danish SS. It was called the Schalberg Corps. There was this great fear of the Russians, and especially the Russians. When the war was over, the Russians went on to there's an island to the south of Denmark, which is a Danish island, Bornholm. And the Russians moved in, and one of the people I got to know took me on a tour of, they have really lovely cemeteries in Copenhagen. she took me to the Mill Cemetery, and we were there just about at the time when they were celebrating like their Veterans Day or something. And so there were flags all over, and I noticed that there were Soviet flags, and there were other graves where there were no flags. And this wasn't that long ago. And my friend, who knows about these things and these tours, said, well, that's where the Russian soldiers are buried. And I said, well, what about this? And she said, that's where the German soldiers are buried. Generally, they're buried four, one on top of the other, without any markers on it. So, kind of contradictory, but interesting. Yes?
Is it true or not that the king put on a yellow star?
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. That was British propaganda. The king of Denmark never wore a yellow star. The Jews in Denmark never were asked to wear a yellow star. But I think what's important about it is everybody believes it happened because it's a demonstration of support that the king could have done. The students saw a newsreel where the king would go out every day. He'd ride his horse, unprotected by any soldiers, through the center of Copenhagen. And someone once said to him, you go out in these crowds, you know, who protects you? And he said, well, the people protect me. They're with me all the way. So. Yes?
What exactly did the Jews do when they got to Sweden? If
What?
they weren't particularly welcome?
Oh, the Jews were very welcomed in Sweden.
But didn't you say that the Swedish were not always happy to have them sent over?
I haven't read much about there being any. I'm sure there was anti-Semitism, but
I mean,
they were well taken care of.
Were they taken in by families, or how did they?
Initially, they were taken in by some Jewish families, etc. There was a big issue about the men taking jobs from Swedes, but they seem to work it out. That is a very interesting trait in Danish society, and in fact in Scandinavia, they have more of a tradition of kind of working it out. That's where the first ombudsmen's men were, it's a concept that was created in Denmark. And where there is contention, very often they believe that they can't just leave the contention and it needs to be worked through. So the Swedes were, I think that the Swedes helped. They had help from the Danish government, and also the Jewish community had funds that they couldn't use, but the Danish government lent them money against them. So the thing with the Swedes was, you know, the war was definitely going to not go the Germans' way, and the Swedes had been very pragmatic in their neutrality. They were, you know, there's a story. I've seen a picture of it myself, but I've seen a gold ingot, and you might imagine where it came from. They melted down, the Germans melted down the teeth that they extracted. And sitting right in the middle of this ingot is a tooth. And I have seen a picture of it. So they would sell that gold to the Swedes, and the currency changed.
Is it true that any Allied planes that tried to fly over Sweden were shot down by the bomber? I've heard that, but I'm not sure.
I don't know. I don't know.
What was the question?
Is it true that any Allied planes that tried to fly over Sweden were shot down? I can't think about why they would fly over.
And also during transport, like the ships and stuff were allowed to go through Sweden waters.
Yes. survivor who was also on the faculty here told me that in the last days that he was incarcerated, he would have died if a Swede hadn't given him some of his parcel to eat. So yes, Danish policemen were arrested and they were interned. There were some things that the government did that were not, I mean, they're not, I hope you don't believe that they were perfect. But there were, I'm trying to remember where it was sent. I believe it might have been Saxon. Yeah, and I think, as I remember now, that, I don't know the exact number, that more Danish policemen died in concentration camps than did Jews from Denmark. In fact, I know that for a fact. I just don't know.
You talked about Denmark being the largest example of this kind of sabotage and resistance. And I know the Chambon, but the students may not. But were there other groups that had this kind of belief that motivated them to extend their universe of moral obligation to save Jews?
Yeah, I mentioned Zagoda in Poland. There were groups in Holland, several of them. Most people don't know that the woman who was responsible for finding Anne Frank's diary. Who was that? Yeah. Duchess, almost as hard to pronounce as a disease of the throat. But the woman who was bringing food, if you remember the diary, please. I will never say it again. She was bringing food to the Frank family and the people in the annex, etc. But she and her husband were also hiding several other people. This was not a solitary act on their part. And her, I believe it's an autobiography, although she wrote it with someone, is just amazing. And there were Dutch and Belgian social workers that saved children. I mean, the Danes are not alone in risking their lives and their property to help people.
Come here, Bulgaria.
Not
So it's a
Bulgaria.
very untold story. I don't think there's even a book on it.
I think there is.
Is there things in book? I read our meeting with them.
I wrote a paper for Professor Stein.
That's it. Anyway, they never turned over, officially turned
They
over,
did turn over some of them.
but not in
Right. It was not a clear case. Bulgaria. Okay, thanks very much.